The first time I heard the name Phi Pop, it wasn't from a horror film or a ghost hunter. It came from an elderly man in northeastern Thailand who lowered his voice the moment the sun dipped behind the rice fields. He told me that there were some stories that villagers would only share in daylight. After sunset, they preferred silence. He never said whether he believed the stories himself. He simply said that every village has one house people stop walking past after dark. This is one of those stories. Several decades ago, in a farming village tucked deep within Thailand's Isan region, life followed the rhythm of the seasons. At sunrise, monks walked barefoot through the narrow dirt lanes, collecting alms. Farmers disappeared into the rice fields before the heat settled over the land. Children chased one another beneath tamarind trees until their mothers called them home for dinner. Nothing remarkable ever happened there, and that was exactly how the villagers liked it. Among them lived an elderly widow named Maid One. She wasn't feared or avoided. If anything, she was respected. In her day, she had delivered babies, tended to fevers, and knew the names of medicinal plants that grew along the edge of the forest. When someone fell ill, people often sought her advice before traveling to the nearest clinic. Then one rainy season, something changed. At first, it was so ordinary that nobody paid much attention. Maid One stopped joining the women at the morning market. She declined invitations to temple ceremonies. When neighbors greeted her, she smiled politely but never stepped outside her gate. People assumed that old age had finally caught up with her. A week later, livestock began disappearing. Not entire animals, just a chicken here, a goat there. The fences remained untouched, and there were no signs of thieves. Wild animals sometimes wandered close to the village, so no one gave it much thought until the dogs started barking. Every night, just after midnight, every dog in the village would begin growling toward the same narrow lane leading to Maid One's house. None of them would enter it. One young farmer tried dragging his hunting dog closer. The animal fought so desperately to pull away that it slipped out of its collar and ran all the way back to the rice fields. By then, the whispers had begun. No one spoke them loudly, certainly not inside the temple, but around cooking fires and beneath raised wooden homes. A single name quietly passed from one person to another. The Phi Pop, an old belief, a possessing spirit set to enter a person and slowly hollow them from within. Some believed it fed on flesh. Others insisted it consumed something far less visible: vitality, luck, the quiet strength that kept a family together. Nobody could agree on what it truly was. Everyone agreed they wanted nothing to do with it. The village headman dismissed the rumors. He reminded everyone that fear spreads faster than disease. For a while, his words worked, until Somchai died. He was 32 years old, healthy, and strong enough to carry sacks of rice across his shoulders without stopping to rest. His wife found him in bed before dawn. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle. The doctor from the neighboring district could offer no clear explanation. The funeral should have ended the gossip. Instead, they grew, and long before spread through the village. People began noticing things they had ignored before. Children claimed that they had seen Maidwan standing beside the irrigation canal long after midnight. The fisherman swore he saw someone laughing across the water, though no lanterns burned anywhere nearby. The village school teacher said he had caught sight of an old woman watching the classrooms from behind a banana grove before sunrise. When he looked again, she was gone. Perhaps each person had seen something different. Perhaps none of them had seen anything at all. But once suspicion settles into a village, every ordinary moment begins to look unfamiliar. People stop sharing meals with neighbors. Parents hurry their children indoors before dusk. Visitors from nearby villages notice the silence long before anyone explained it. Even the monks sensed something had changed. One evening, the abbot visited Maid One with food and prayers. She thanked him through the closed door. She never opened it. That was the last time anyone admitted speaking with her. Several days later, smoke stopped rising from her kitchen. She stopped fetching water or tending to her small vegetable garden. The village headman finally gathered a group of men and decided they would enter the house together. They found the front door unlocked. The rooms were clean. The cooking pot still rested above cold ashes. Her sandals remained beside the entrance, exactly where she had always left them. Maid One herself had vanished. There was no sign of a struggle, there was no note left behind, and no indication that she had packed anything. The only unusual thing, according to the men who entered, was that every window had been carefully covered from the inside, shutting out every trace of daylight. The house was abandoned before sunset. Nobody volunteered to live there. Months passed. Eventually, another family moved into the village, unaware of the story. Life slowly returned to normal. Children laughed in the streets again. Markets became crowded. The whispers faded. Years later, an elderly monk who had once served that village was asked if the Phi Pop had truly been there. There are a lot of possibilities that may support the theory, he said. He looked toward the rice fields stretching into the distance. But I know this. Before the rumors began, everyone trusted one another. By the time they ended, every family had locked its doors against its neighbors. Then he stopped, adjusted his robe, and prepared to leave. As he reached the temple steps, he paused just once. Without turning around, he quietly added, "And no one ever asked what frightened Maid Duan enough to hide inside her own home." Sometimes the oldest ghost stories are not about the spirits people believe they saw. They're about the fear that quietly moved through an entire village wearing a human face. When I was a teenager, life was pretty simple. I was shy, so I mostly stayed at home reading books. My life centered around my family. I lived with my mom, my grandmother, and my brother. My dad worked overseas. We only ever saw him during the holidays. And by that, I mean once a year, around Christmas. Ours was a typical Catholic household in the Philippines. Night prayers, church every Sunday. I always kept my rosary close to me. I had a very strange experience when I was about 15. For the first time in my life, I started suffering from severe migraines. They became so intense that I couldn't lie down after a headache. I couldn't even read for a long time or watch TV. They were also accompanied by really vivid and strange dreams where blood is oozing out from walls and everything around me is just crumbling. I wasn't sure what to make out of it. It wasn't something I was hyper focused on. After several visits to the doctor, they finally began to ease. 4 months later, they disappeared altogether. Everything went back to normal until one night. I had a dream. At first, there was nothing unusual about it. I was at home, walking from room to room, tidying up, talking to my grandmother, doing all the ordinary things I would normally do. Eventually, she walked into another room, leaving me standing by myself in the hallway. I remember looking at something my father had bought me. I remember smiling, and then, without warning, a man stepped out from behind the couch. He simply stood there, staring at me. I remember feeling terrified. Then he slowly began walking towards me. That's when I woke up. It was one of the worst nightmares I ever had. I told myself it was probably just a night terror, but I was mistaken. Every night for the next several days, the dreams always began the same way. I would be sitting quietly, reading a book, brushing my teeth, walking through my house, doing completely ordinary things, when he would just appear, always without warning, as though he had been there all along, waiting for me to notice him. This continued for an entire week. I tried convincing myself it would eventually stop. I didn't tell my mother. She already had enough on her plate. Then, one night, in my dream, I was standing in front of a mirror, combing my hair. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught the slightest movement near the cupboard. I turned and watched him step out from behind it. At that moment, every attempt to be brave disappeared. I couldn't move. I could only watch as he walked slowly towards me and drove a knife into my chest. I woke up in tears. My family was at my side. I told them about the dreams and how this man had been haunting me for a while. I remember my grandmother saying, "This is an omen. Something is about to happen." My mother immediately cut her off. She brought holy oil and applied it on my forehead. We knelt and prayed, said the rosary. We did this for a while before going to bed. After that, the haunting stopped. I never saw the man again. Later on, I questioned my grandmother about the omen. She told me that she had experienced the same thing when she was a child, and soon after, someone very dear to her was taken away too soon. I was horrified listening to this. I told myself I knew better than to believe old wives' tales. 6 months later, my father met with a tragic accident. He worked at an oil rig and a fire broke out. Many managed to escape, but my father was trapped. By the time he was rescued, he succumbed to his injuries. This was heartbreaking for my family because my brother and I had to step up. We didn't have time to grieve and process what had happened. We were forced to start working. My grandmother stared at me throughout my father's funeral. I knew what she was thinking. I knew she believed that it was an omen. My mother vehemently denies it. Sure, we are a religious family, but each one of us has our own interpretation of our faith. What happened to my dad was an accident, so I chose to believe that too. Although the one thing that I'm not able to get out of my head is that image of the man coming out from behind the closet. I mean, I still remember his face even though it's been 15 years. It's like that moment when you know something is about to happen, but it still shocks you after experiencing it. I think that moment will stay with me for the rest of my life. In Mongolia, there's an old belief that the dead are never truly gone. They remain in the mountains they protected, the rivers they crossed, and the grasslands where their horses once ran. The Mongolian steppe also has a way of making a person feel very small. The land stretches farther than the eye can follow, where grass bends beneath a restless wind, and the horizon seems to disappear into the sky itself. Travelers who crossed these plains often said that the silence carried farther here than sound, and the dead, they remain with the mountains. To disturb the resting place of an ancestor wasn't simply disrespectful. It was to forget who had protected the land long before you arrived. In the spring of 1912, a surveying company arrived in northern Mongolia. Their assignment seemed simple enough. A new railway had been proposed to shorten the journey between two growing settlements. The route promised faster trade, easier travel, and new opportunities for the villages scattered across the region. On paper, the shortest path crossed an empty valley. To the surveyors, it was a little more than open ground. To the local herders, it had a different name, the Valley of Sleeping Riders. An elderly nomad named Bhat Saikan met the engineers as they unloaded their equipment. His face carried the weather of many winters, and he leaned quietly against the walking stick while watching men drive wooden stakes into the earth. He asked a question. Has anyone told you who rests beneath this valley? The chief engineer smiled politely. We've been told many stories. Batsai Khan nodded. They are not stories. Then he turned his horse and rode away. No one tried to stop him. The work then began the following morning. Measurements were taken, flags were planted, theodolites were carefully aligned toward distant hills. By evening, every survey marker stood exactly where the engineer had placed it. When dawn arrived, half of them had disappeared. The workers assumed local children had pulled them from the ground. New markers were placed. The following morning, they were gone again. When the workers were questioned, they said that the site was empty and there were no traces of footprints. The soft earth surrounding each marker remained undisturbed. The chief engineer dismissed it as a sabotage. He doubted the night watch, but nothing happened. The guards saw no one, yet by sunrise the valley looked untouched once more. As the weeks went by, stranger problems emerged. The horses refused to enter the southern half of the valley. Animals that had crossed mountain passes without hesitation would suddenly stop, ears pulled back, refusing every command to move forward. One horse threw its rider rather than taking another step. Another broke free from its tether and galloped several miles across the grasslands before anyone caught it. The Mongolian workers exchanged nervous glances. The foreign engineers blamed the wolves. But there were no wolves that appeared. One afternoon, a young assistant named Erdine uncovered something while digging a foundation marker. A single carved stone rested beneath the soil. Its surface had been worn smooth by centuries of wind, but faint symbols still remained. Batsai Khan arrived before sunset. They weren't aware of how he was informed about this. He climbed down the shallow excavation and brushed dirt from the stone with surprising care. This should not have been uncovered. The chief engineer folded his arms. It's only a stone. The old man looked at him. No, it's the promise beneath it. He asked the workers to rebury it before nightfall. The request was refused. The stone was loaded into a wagon instead. That night, the wind was unyielding. It moved across the valley with a steady, mournful voice that slipped through every rope and canvas seam. There were no signs of rains or heavy clouds, just a heavy gust of wind sweeping through. The camp barely slept, not because they were frightened, but because someone kept hearing horses, hundreds of them, galloping somewhere beyond the darkness. The sound circled the valley until sunrise. When daylight finally arrived, there wasn't a single hoof print anywhere on the ground. Construction continued. Progress slowed. Tools disappeared without explanation. Freshly measured distances no longer matched the previous day's records. A bridge foundation shifted several feet overnight despite the ground remaining solid beneath it. Arguments became common. Each surveyor blamed another. Maps no longer agreed. Even simple directions became points of disagreements. Men who had worked together for years suddenly accused one another of incompetence. The valley seemed determined to reject certainty itself. Several workers resigned. Others simply packed their belongings one morning and walked away without collecting their wages. When asked why, none of them gave the same answer. Someone spoke of dreams. Another claimed he kept seeing riders standing along distant ridge lines before vanishing into the morning fog. One man refused to explain. He merely bowed toward the valley before leaving. Only Erdine remained curious. He returned to Batsai Khan's camp one evening, carrying the carved stone they had removed weeks earlier. The old nomad stared at it for a long time before speaking. My grandfather is buried somewhere beneath that valley. So is his father, and his father before him. Erdine looked across the endless grasslands. But there are no graves. There were never meant to be graves, said the old man. We remember where they rest. The land remembers it too. Together, they carried the stone back before sunrise. Just a simple walk to the original spot. There was no ceremony. The old man placed it back into the earth exactly where it had been found. Then he scattered a handful of milk across the grass. Just a simple offering to the land. When the engineers arrived later that morning, they found every measuring instrument lying beside the excavation. They were neatly arranged and did not appear damaged. It seemed like someone had carefully decided that the work was finished. The chief engineer stood in silence for a while. By evening, he ordered the railway redirected around the valley. No explanation was recorded in the official reports. The maps were quietly revised. Construction continued several miles away. No further incidents were ever reported. Today, travelers still cross those grasslands. The railway exists. It simply takes a longer route than originally planned. Many passengers never notice. The valley appears no different from the countless others stretching across Mongolia. Only the oldest herders still glance toward it as they pass. Some remove their hats, some leave a few drops of milk upon the earth. Others simply continue walking in respectful silence. Not because they believe the ancestors are waiting to punish the living, but because there are places where memory is older than maps. And perhaps there are some journeys that should never be shortened. The valley is still there, waiting beneath the same endless sky, exactly where it has always been. Every year during the Ghost Festival, families across Vietnam gather along rivers after sunset. They light paper lanterns, whisper prayers for those who have passed on, and place the lanterns upon the water. The belief is simple. If the lanterns drift peacefully downstream, the soul has found its way. But older villagers tell a quieter story. Sometimes one lantern refuses to follow the river. The village of Mayan rested beside one of the countless waterways that wound through the Mekong Delta. The river fed the rice fields. It carried merchants between villages. Children learned to swim in its muddy currents before they were old enough to read. The villagers respected the river, but they never believed it belonged entirely to the living. Among them lived a young woman named Lin. 2 years ago, her elder brother Min had disappeared during the monsoon season. He had left before dawn to ferry supplies across the river. His boat was found. His hat was found. Even the bundle of rice he had been carrying washed ashore several days later. But Min himself was never recovered. Without a body, there was no funeral. And without a grave, there was nowhere for the family to pray. His mother continued setting an extra bowl of rice at every dinner. His father refused to remove Min's sandals from beside the front door. And every ghost festival, Lin returned to the river. That year, rain had fallen for nearly a week before the festival. Mist drifted across the water. The villagers gathered quietly beneath rows of hanging lanterns. Children laughed as they folded paper boats. Monks chanted prayers that echoed softly over the river. One by one, families lit their lanterns. Some carried messages written inside. Others whispered names before setting them upon the water. Hundreds of tiny lights floated away together, slowly, peacefully, like stars carried by the current. Lynn waited for the crowd to leave. She then unfolded a small paper lantern that she had spent hours making herself. Inside, she placed a single sheet of paper. It carried 3 words: "Come home, brother." She lit the candle and whispered, "If you're still searching, follow the light." She lowered the lantern into the river and watched it drift away. At first, it moved with all the others. Then something changed. The lantern slowed. The current continued carrying every other lantern downstream, but hers stopped. It rocked gently in place, almost as though someone was holding on to it. Several people in the village noticed. The lantern turned, not spinning, it just turned, as if choosing a different direction. And then it began floating upstream, against the current. Lynn stared in disbelief. She had grown up beside this river. She knew its flow. Nothing traveled that way. The lantern moved slowly, steadily, never once wavering. It passed beneath an old wooden bridge, past tangled mangrove roots, past fishing boats tied for the night. Without thinking, Lynn followed. The farther she walked, the quieter everything became. The chanting behind her faded. The music disappeared. Even the insects seemed to fall silent. Only the lantern remained. Its tiny flame never flickered. Eventually, it reached a narrow bend where the river widened into a still pool surrounded by reeds. The lantern drifted toward the center. Then it stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Lynn whispered her brother's name. Then the surface of the water rippled, not from wind, not from fish, from footsteps. Soft circles spread outward, one after another, as though someone unseen was slowly walking beneath the surface. The lantern went out. Darkness returned. Lynn waited until sunrise. Villagers eventually found her sitting alone by the river bank. She couldn't explain why, only that she had stayed until dawn because she thought someone might be coming home. The following year, she returned again, as she had always done. This time, the lantern drifted peacefully downstream, just like every other lantern on the river. She smiled, placed her hands together, and walked home. Years later, after Lynn herself had passed away, younger villagers continued celebrating the ghost festival. And as the story goes, among the hundreds of lanterns floating towards the sea, one could still be seen traveling in the opposite direction, always carrying a single flame, always disappearing at the same quiet bend in the river. And the elders would fittingly say, not every soul is searching for the afterlife. Some are still trying to find their way home. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, I hope you'll consider subscribing. All of these stories are original and inspired by the tales we grew up hearing. Every week, I bring you new stories inspired by the folklore, myths, and legends of Asia. Have you experienced being haunted in your dreams? I would love to hear about it. And if you have a favorite story from your own country or culture, please drop it in the comments or send it to me at asian.myth.horror@gmail.com. I'm always looking for new tales to feature in an upcoming episode. Until next time, and when you feel something stepping out of the dark when you least expect it, take a deep breath and keep your lantern lit.